Steven Goldfeder is the founder of OffChain Labs. OffChain Labs is a company focused on Ethereum scaling solutions and known primarily for building Arbitrum, which is currently Ethereum's biggest layer 2. In our conversation, Steven will explain how OffChain Labs is addressing the scalability challenges of Ethereum by using off-chain computation and optimistic rollups. We get into the Arbitrum airdrop, its governance drama, the big vision for Arbitrum and Layer 2s as a whole, and what the next milestones are for the scaling solution. But first, Steven starts the interview by explaining the basics of Arbitrum.
OffChain Labs is a company that built the Arbitrum Nitro technology. And what Arbitrum Nitro does, it's an optimistic rollup that scales Ethereum, really scales any underlying blockchain. But practically, we are big Ethereum believers, and we're scaling Ethereum. We built technology to scale Ethereum, I should say. And the way that it works is basically, as the name OffChain Labs includes in it, takes a lot of the work and the computation off-chain. It's a rollup, so it's an optimistic rollup. What that means is it takes a lot of these stuff off-chain and just puts enough on-chain in order for for Ethereum, I should say, to validate the correctness of what happens off-chain. So in practice, you have Arbitrum transactions. The core data is sent to Ethereum, but then the actual execution of that state and the storage of that state happens off-chain, and then the results are reported back to Ethereum. And then via the interactive dispute the dispute resolution process that Arbitrum introduced, the interactive fraud proofs, you can prove to Ethereum can get confidence of the correctness of what happens off-chain. The way that this scales is you can do a lot more off-chain than Ethereum itself could actually validate. And it's actually, you can increase your capacity in this way, because if Ethereum was actually trying to run all the transactions that happened off-chain, it wouldn't be able to. It's just way more than Ethereum could naturally process itself. However, by doing it off-chain, just proving the result to Ethereum can validate the proof and verify all these transactions that it didn't actually do itself. And that's what I said actually is core just about to any rollup. Arbitrum, the way that Arbitrum differentiates itself, it's an optimistic rollup with interactive fraud proofs that we at OffChain Labs really innovated. And the Arbitrum technology stack, the Arbitrum Nitro stack, is the only technology stack today that actually has all these core security functions built out. And in the case of the live Arbitrum blockchains, which are now decentralized and managed and run by the Arbitrum DAO and Foundation, they are large instances of running this technology in a production environment with a lot of really successful and large ecosystem as well.
So can you go a bit deeper on how Arbitrum differentiates from other optimistic rollups? Like the next biggest one is Optimism. So you're saying that it's I think in the way that the technology proves that the transaction happens is Arbitrum does this in a little bit differently than Optimism does. But can you explain exactly how?
So historically, actually, had you asked me that question a year or two ago, I would have given you a different answer. I'll walk through that. Historically, Arbitrum, since the earliest days of Arbitrum, since the academic paper, which was published in 2018, but even beforehand, Arbitrum has pioneered interactive fraud proofs, which is a particular way of doing these fraud proofs. And what it basically does is it takes a dispute of a large amount of information and boils it down to a really small dispute via an interactive process. You imagine you have a referee and you have this dispute, and rather than adjudicating the whole dispute, you cut it down into shorter and shorter and shorter and smaller via this interactive process until you get down to what we call a one-step dispute. And for a one-step dispute, you do something called a one-step proof, where you just do a one step of running that computation on-chain. For those that have a bit of a technical background, it's running what you call a binary search, right? So it's taking a lot of disagreement and it's cutting it in the middle and trying to figure out, well, do you disagree about the first half or the second half? And you keep doing this till you get down to the smallest point of disagreement. So the Arbitrum, that's always been Arbitrum's the approach of the Arbitrum technology back from when we wrote the academic paper once upon a time, all the way through to what's running on the production chains today and what's in the Arbitrum Nitro stack today. You mentioned Optimism. So they historically had a different approach where they wouldn't do this interactive bisection. They would do this one shot. The idea is that someone challenges and you just run the entire challenge set on chain. You don't make the dispute smaller. It had several limitations, and actually at this point they've abandoned that path, and there's actually pretty much consensus now in the I'll say, roll-up community that the way to build an optimistic roll-up is this path with these interactive fraud proofs. But from a very technical and practical standpoint, these fraud proofs have been live from day one of Arbitrum's first testnet, live in production, and they're live in the Arbitrum Nitro stack today and running in production. But no other chain, no other optimistic rollup has actually built these, and these are core to actually giving the security. So there are other chains that are other teams that are working on building an optimistic rollup, but the core security piece, the proofs, and the reason why those are core is because they're the piece that allows you to say this chain derives its security from Ethereum, right? Because it's the piece that allows Ethereum to actually verify the block and validate that it's true. Without these proofs, there's a block, there's some transactions, there's Ethereum, but there's no way that Ethereum can actually validate it and really correct it if it needs to. And so Arbitrum is the only chain, the technology stack today, and the Arbitrum 1 and Nitro chain and Nova chains are the only live chains today that are actually running an optimistic rollup that has these core security proofs operational and fully built out.
In practice, how does the end user see these differences or this way of operating, or do they not really?
Yeah, so the answer is, ironically, they don't really, right? So it's kind of like a mechanism where it's important to be there because it's securing the chain underneath the hood, but it actually never gets invoked. So if you ask me, how often do these proofs get invoked? How often are there challenges and disputes that need to be adjudicated? The actual answer is, in the history of the Arbitrum 1 and Nova blockchains on Ethereum, it's never happened. It actually did happen once, interestingly. So when the merge happened, there was the ETH proof of work chain, ETH POW, and that had its own instance of Arbitrum. And on that chain, actually, someone tried to steal the funds from the forked Arbitrum contract, and it was and the proof played out, and they were stopped. So there actually has been one production environment where that's happened. But the reason why that probably happened on that chain is because maybe they thought no one was looking or no one was validating or verifying, so they tested that assumption, and it turned out that they lost. But in general, the way that the incentives work out, people don't really try to challenge on chain because they know they're going to lose, right? It's like that type of mechanism where it has to be there to secure the chain, but since it's there, it doesn't actually get invoked. So from an end user perspective, from someone just wanting, and even a developer perspective, someone wanting to develop on the chain or build an app, they don't engage with this at all. What they engage with is a blockchain interface. Arbitrum supports the full EVM. It's as compatible as possible or equivalent as people say. And the Arbitrum technology supports that today, so it just gives someone the exact same EVM experience that they get in Ethereum. Generally, on the live chains, all the tooling is there as well. So if you want your oracles from Chainlink, or your block explorer from Etherscan, or your nodes from Alchemy or Infura or QuickNode, usually the Arbitrum chains have the same infrastructure today, and the developer experience is really just about the same as Ethereum, and they don't really engage with these differences. But if they want to look under the hood and say, what's different here? How is Ethereum actually providing security to this chain? That's where this stuff matters. But and interestingly, and something which we can get to maybe later is there are plans to build technology that will actually differentiate that a little bit. That would allow developers to write code in other languages on the Arbitrum chains. This is called Arbitrum Stylus. Again. Whether or not it gets adopted by the public chains is up to the DAO, but this is technology that's in development today that will actually allow, on the Arbitrum Nitro technology stack, one to write contracts not only in the EVM languages, but also in Rust and C and C++. So we'll actually, at that point, you'll have a differentiated developer experience in the Arbitrum stack. But today, it's really fully just EVM equivalent, as they say. And your average developer won't notice this, and hopefully they never will. But it's critical to have those security apparatus there, because you want the chain to be secured, and even if it's in practice doesn't need to be invoked.
Going back to the end user, which right now is depositing 5.6 billion of TVL on Arbitrum. I wanted to get your take on what the biggest use case has been. Like how are people actually using this layer 2?
Yeah, so I think so there are two live Arbitrum ecosystem chains today. Those are Arbitrum 1 and Arbitrum, which is the one you referenced, which has $5.6 or so billion of TVL on the chain, and there's Arbitrum Nova, which is a second chain that's really devoted to gaming. So the Arbitrum technology stack, the Arbitrum Nitro stack, is very general, and it allows you to have the full expressiveness of the Ethereum virtual machine. So you can build really whatever you want. But I guess your question is, but who's actually building? What's driving this usage and adoption? And I would say those are differentiated by those chains. The Arbitrum 1 blockchain is primarily the stronghold for DeFi. It is pretty clearly at this point the strongest and DeFi ecosystem potentially outside of Ethereum layer 1 itself. And there's just so much innovation that's happening there. When someone's launching a new DeFi protocol, they'll generally at this point do it in Arbitrum 1 for a few reasons. That's where the users are. That's where the other projects that they want to tap into are. Generally, lots of DeFi projects rely on other projects and synchronously interact with other DeFi projects. So the network effect there is really important. And Arbitrum 1 is primarily its strongest. Its strongest probably vertical by number of projects is DeFi, but it also has really strong other ecosystems as well. Notably, for example, in the NFT space, Treasure DAO, their ecosystem is on Arbitrum 1, and an incredibly strong community, very devoted and great community that's building incredible things. And it's not only the core Treasure collections, but it's also the gaming platforms that are building on Treasure and building with them as well. So there's that all happening on the Arbitrum 1 ecosystem, and then there's also the Arbitrum Nova ecosystem, which is really focused on social and gaming. And it's from a practical perspective because the fees in Arbitrum Nova are significantly lower than even Arbitrum 1. So Arbitrum 1 fees are already well over 90%, 95+% cheaper than Ethereum. It depends what you're doing, but often Arbitrum Nova is even significantly more cheap than that. In doing so, it's built on a little bit of a different security model. So it runs what we call the Arbitrum AnyTrust technology as opposed to the Arbitrum rollup technology, and it's really targeted at those applications that need the fast speeds delivered by the Arbitrum Nitro technology, need the low fees, but actually need even lower fees because they're doing really high transaction volume. And critical to this are games. Games fit into this bucket where it used to be once upon a time blockchain games were exciting because they were really targeted at blockchain developers and blockchain users, and they were just excited that you could play a game on this technology. The new wave of gaming we're seeing, they're game first and blockchain application second. What that means is their mandate is to be a good game. Like that's number one. And that means that whether or not I care about the blockchain, I care about Arbitrum, I care about Ethereum, I care about decentralization, shouldn't matter. These should target a general audience that wants to have a great gameplay. Secondly, they tap into the blockchain ecosystem to provide different benefits to those who are aware and potentially to those who are not aware as well. But that's secondary, and what that means is, they really need. So, what are some things that they need? One, they need fast transaction processing speed, right? If you're playing a game and you don't really care about the blockchain, you don't know much about it, but you press a button and then like a spinner shows up for 10, 15 seconds, like not the best user experience. And also, if your wallet's getting drained, often not the most fun game. And those are the things that I think are really important to them, and that's why Arbitrum Nova is an ideal solution. But also has not just gaming; it's other social applications as well. Notably, Reddit's community points is live on Arbitrum Nova, the Arbitrum Nova blockchain, and that's the opportunity for in certain sub communities on Reddit for people to interact in the communities and get these points. Now, these points don't live on the Reddit platform anymore exclusively, but they also are represented on the blockchain and owned and self-custodied by those who want to take custody of their own points as well. And again, a more mass market, high demand application, and that needs even lower fees in order for it to be for it to make sense for its users.
And just like a quick follow up on Arbitrum 1, like the DeFi vertical is like the main thing, like DEXs, like token swaps. Is that kind of the use case that's taking off there?
Yeah, there's a lot of DeFi. I would say again innovation there. GMX is obviously well known as one of the strongest players on Arbitrum 1. but also has that's in the derivative space, but also so I would say derivatives, futures, options are definitely very strong there, but also other innovative DeFi projects as well. So it could be a different DEX design, off-chain order book, etc. Lots of interesting projects coming on. There's a lot of similarities between there's several DeFi verticals and often similarities between them, and but it's often about experimentation as well and a slightly different design. And we're seeing a lot of differentiated designs on Arbitrum, which is interesting. That's what I mean by innovation, right? So on other blockchains, you'll often see someone copy a project. Often the code is open source, so they'll launch a Uniswap V2 clone or an Aave clone, etc. But in Arbitrum, we're actually seeing strong teams innovate and change that and say, what about if we try this? What about if we launch a DEX or a derivatives protocol that does this? And the other interesting thing is seeing projects come from other networks to the Arbitrum network. So notably here, you have earlier this year, the Trader Joe team expanded from Avalanche, but also wanted to be part of the ecosystem on Arbitrum 1, and they've been fantastically successful there. Similarly, you have the Gains protocol team coming from Polygon. That was also in the derivative space, and they, I think pretty quickly, maybe in a week or so, the majority of the volume they were doing was actually on the Arbitrum 1 chain. So Arbitrum 1 became their main platform. Similarly, you have Lyra, an options protocol coming from the Optimism ecosystem. So I think it's a lot of innovation there and a lot of others as well. The one thing about the Arbitrum ecosystem, and I say this as just really a community member. Obviously, OffChain Labs had a big role in building and developing initially the Arbitrum ecosystem, but today we don't have a privileged role in the ecosystem. But I'm definitely a very interested community member and engaged community member. And one thing we see is the Arbitrum community is very open and welcoming and collaborative and non-exclusive in that way. So and these other projects can come and expand from other networks and be welcomed into the ecosystem, and I think do quite well there. So it's definitely exciting to see.
About this, like this migration from other layer ones onto Arbitrum, it kind of links with a question I wanted to ask on this interesting take I saw on Twitter by Justin Bonds, is the account from Cyber Capital. And he was making the case that scaling a blockchain exclusively through layer 2s is a terrible idea. And I think, summarizing his point is that, one, there's a lot of UX trade-offs, and two, it ends up making the actual layer 1 less secure because there's less attention being paid to scaling the layer 1, in this case Ethereum, and he's arguing that layer 2s can never be as secure as layer 1s. So in the case of developers who are giving up layer 1 security to come to layer 2s, do you think that Arbitrum and other layer 2s can compete with layer 1s in terms of security and decentralization, or is there always a trade-off there being made towards scalability?
Yeah, so I haven't actually seen the thread directly, so I'll comment on your characterization of it. Just a disclaimer. But I think there are a few things to be said. One is, it's true that blockchains in general have a UX, have ways to go in UX, particularly as I was mentioning before, or alluding to before. I was talking about gaming. If you wanted to target sort of mass developers, mass market, not just looking for the blockchain enthusiasts, UX, particularly around issues like key custody, are going to be very important. But I can't think of any way in which the UX of a layer 2 for an average user is worse than the UX of a layer 1. And here's what I mean. For example, if you're a Coinbase user or a Binance user, you can say withdraw my funds directly to Arbitrum 1, just like you could to any layer 1. You don't even need to engage in the fact, I'll get to the security point in a second, but you don't even, as a user, don't even need to engage in the fact that you're on a layer 2. And part of that point we discussed before, which is this is all the apparatus happening in the background to secure the chain. But it looks to a user just like Ethereum, and just like any other blockchain that's running the EVM software. And therefore, I'm hard pressed to understand what the argument would be that the UX of or the user experience of layer 2 is any worse than a layer 1.
I guess like having to bridge funds is like really cumbersome. Like it's not very straightforward to most users. Having to like switch networks.
Yeah. So again, having to switch networks, it doesn't matter if we're layer 1s or layer 2s. That's the same as happening in a multi-network world. You're going to have to switch networks. And if Arbitrum was a layer 1 and if there were 5 layer 1s or 3 of them were layer 2s, it wouldn't matter. Like the network switching is the same. And also bridging funds. That's what I was alluding to before, which like so a user needs to get their funds somehow. There are users that that have funds already, obviously. So those users need to, or on other blockchains, need to engage with bridging. But again, in a multi-chain world, you'll need to engage with bridging unless you just want to commit to one chain. So if one's argument that there should only be one blockchain, that's a fine argument to have. It could be, for users, that could be a layer 1 chain or a layer 2 chain. But in any multi-chain world, bridging is going to be a challenge for some of the UX, but it doesn't have to be a challenge. As I mentioned before, the centralized exchanges can serve as bridges. The same way you initially would get your, if you're a user that's coming to the blockchain space for the first time, you have no funds here. So what are you going? You're going to have to find some entry point. You can use a centralized exchange. You can use a fiat on ramp, but it's fundamentally most of the fiat on ramps and most of the centralized exchanges connect directly to the Arbitrum chain today, for example, and many other layer 2s. So I don't really see much of a hurdle there. Sure, for users that are already on Ethereum and coming to Arbitrum, they're going to have to bridge. But it's hard to argue that you shouldn't introduce a new chain because then, and again, unless your argument is never introduce any chain, another chain, because it doesn't really matter that it's a layer 2. You can introduce a layer 1 chain as well, and you're still going to have to get your funds there and bridge, and it's probably going to be a worse process because actually the layer 2 bridges are deeply connected to the layer 1 and provide a level of security that a third-party bridge between chains that aren't connected really couldn't offer. So I don't see why there are any particular worse security assumptions here. And on the security point, that less eyes are viewing this, or less eyes are we're going to distract from maybe the layer 1 chain. I'll just point to practice where I think we can look at Ethereum validation and track it with the success of Arbitrum, and there absolutely has not been less Ethereum validators or a correlation in the uptick of Arbitrum pace with the downward participation in Ethereum. That's just not actually happening in practice. Again, I'm not sure if that's what the thread was suggesting, but that's actually not true in practice. If at one point it was true that it is correct that if everyone sort of looked at the layer 2 and abandoned the layer 1, then the layer 1 wouldn't have security, but that's actually not happening in practice. And again, I think what's the alternative here is the alternative is having, let's think about the alternative. The alternative is having beefier layer 1s. Because again, I'll give you two alternatives. One is having more layer 1s. So you have many layer 1s. Well, you haven't solved your problem because you need people looking at all these layer 1s. So actually, you're much better off by having, because the nice thing about a layer 2 is you don't need the same number of people looking at it. It gets that security from Ethereum. It's a much lower bar that you need of people looking at the layer 2 and validating the layer 2 than the layer 1. I'd rather have that than have a network of layer 1s, each of which have their own security requirements, because then they're not sharing security at all, and actually you'll have that problem. Which if a new layer 1, they're going to be competing for those resources, and some of them are probably going to be less secure. I'd much rather be in a regime where they're sharing those resources, and that's where we are today. Where Arbitrum validation it does have its own validators that need to pay attention, but it only needs one person. Right, it can have 99.99% of validators doing the wrong thing. As long as it has one person doing the right thing, Arbitrum the Arbitrum technology, the Arbitrum chain running the technology will do the right thing and do the correct thing, and that's guaranteed as long as Ethereum is secure. That's a much better world than being in a regime where there are two chains that are just completely independent and need their own validation. And again, so either the suggestion is we shouldn't scale blockchains and we should just have one monolithic chain. It doesn't really work, right? Because then the alternative is you do what some other alternative layer 1s do, where they just beef up the requirements to participate in these chains. They get to the point of unsustainability, and that's the point where actually validators tap out. Because if you build up the chain and increase the capacity of the chain so much that the computational requirements or the storage requirements of running a node of this chain is so high, it becomes impossible for your average user or even power user to validate, and you have a de facto centralization where now in order to validate this chain, you need to have a data center. We've seen chains making this decision, and that's their right to do. I personally think that's a bad trade-off because that's where you have less and less and less decentralization and more centralization, and less security.
Is that Solana doing that?
I don't want to name anyone in particular, but in Solana for sure, the requirements of being a validator are very, very high, much higher than Ethereum. The memory requirements of running one of these nodes are much higher than Ethereum. And it's a layer one, so it doesn't have another chain that can help it provide that security, and therefore, the decentralization, right? You can't, me sitting at home, or me with a cloud instance, the medium-sized cloud instance, can't participate in providing security to this network. I think that's a bad trade-off. So, anyway, that would be my response to that, which I think, if you're going to understand that there is demand for this. People want this technology. People want to use it. We need to scale. Your options are layer 2 technology, which I think is the best option, and the alternatives are increase the capacity of layer 1 or create new layer 1s. If you create new layer 1s, you're actually you're reducing security for all those new layer 1s because they're not sharing security at all. And any UX issues you have by moving to a layer 2, you're going to have on steroids moving to a different layer 1, which have no native connectivity. So I have to. I'll take a look at the thread, but those would be my immediate thoughts to that.
Interesting. So to you, the kind of optimal way forward for like the blockchain industry to scale, it would be through maybe a couple of layer 1s that thrive and are able to scale via layer 2s instead of having multiple layer 1s.
Again, everyone's encouraged, and it's great to see lots of experimentation, different teams building out different visions. My personal vision is Ethereum is clearly the most secure and most decentralized layer 1 blockchain. And layer 2s, the nice thing about Ethereum is you can build layer 2s that piggyback off that security, and the requirements to secure them are much lower than the requirements to secure Ethereum itself, so they can derive meaning much lower marginal cost, meaning they can use Ethereum's validation, and in the case of the Arbitrum chain, just need a validator set that you're sure that there's a one honest validator, as opposed to a different proof of stake or even proof of work chain where you'll need a majority or a super majority of some validator set to be honest. And how do you get a diversified validator set, particularly when you're trying to scale up and make the requirements to become a validator harder? Those are very, very difficult. So the vision that I have is there can be many layer 2 chains on top of Ethereum, but we should have a strong and decentralized and secure base that Ethereum provides that I personally don't think any other blockchain provides today. So in the world that I see it, again, I think there's tremendous room for experimentation here, and I'm not here saying that the other blockchains shouldn't exist or shouldn't explore other parts of this, but where I come from is where I really value the security and decentralization. I'm very focused on the vision of having Ethereum as the base layer and supporting many, or as many, I should say, as many as we need layer 2 chains in order to meet the demand of users. And one thing, where even in the Arbitrum ecosystem today, there are two public chains running the Arbitrum technology and meeting meeting the demands of a different class of users. And that can happen with multiple rollup providers. That can happen with multiple instances of the same technology as well. That to me is probably the most exciting or the most realistic way that we scale and don't compromise on security and decentralization.
You've made the statement that optimistic rollups and Arbitrum get their security from the Ethereum main chain. But what about the sequencer? There's this concern that the sequencers of all or most layer 2s are centralized, controlled by a few parties that are able to have access to that control it basically. If you can kind of address that and also like say if there's any plans to decentralize this piece of Arbitrum?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think this is where those security, the fraud proofs that I mentioned before, that's where it really comes into play, and that's where the difference happens. We mentioned it doesn't matter from a user perspective necessarily in the happy case for a chain that doesn't have fraud proofs or does, but it matters a lot for the security, and this is exactly why. So I think users often misconstrue or confuse the role of the sequencer and a different party in the chain called the validator. These are actually not the same. And I think people often just lump them together because other chains don't really have validators today, because validators only make sense when there's actually this fraud-proof technology. And in Arbitrum's ecosystem, there's both. There's validators and there's the sequencer. So let's talk about what they do. The validator provides the security for the chain, and the sequencer orders transactions. What that means is if you as a user come to send a transaction to an Arbitrum chain, or a chain running the Arbitrum Nitro technology with a sequencer, you're probably going to send a transaction to a sequencer, to the sequencer, although you don't have to. I'll get to that in a second. But you're probably going to send the transaction to the sequencer. The sequencer is going to accept your transaction and give you a receipt. And then the sequencer is going to post that transaction on chain. At this point, there are validators. Validators just look at the transaction set that's posted on chain, and they go ahead and say, okay, we've executed these transactions. This is the result. They report that back to the chain, and if there's a dispute, remember that interactive dispute process we discussed, they'll engage in that, and they'll convince Ethereum what the correct outcome is. Remember, the rollup puts transaction data on chain. It relies on other parties called the validators to prove the result to Ethereum and convince Ethereum of the correctness. So in this case, the validators are the ones providing security for the chain. It's not the sequencer, it's the validators. The sequencer just orders transactions, that's one. It also gives users these like fast confirmations. It does that. And then it goes ahead and, within a minute in the live Arbitrum chains, but, relatively quickly in general, post those transactions on chain. Once the transaction is posted on chain, a user can see that it's posted on chain. No one else can actually undo it unless there's an Ethereum reorg. So once you're a few minutes in that you're confident that Ethereum won't have a reorg, you know that your transaction is posted on chain, you know that it will be included, and you're not relying on the sequencer at all. So the sequencer does give you a fast confirmation, but you can safely bypass that and wait a few minutes for you to have full security without the sequencer. You don't need to rely on that. It's similar to what you do in Ethereum. Like you would wait, or even Bitcoin, right? You'd wait 6 blocks or whatever until, Ethereum, 10 minutes or so until your transaction is securely on chain. Same thing applies for Arbitrum transactions. The sequencer is not the one providing security. It's the validators, and the validators today are actually already run by a diversified set of parties. So who's running validators today on the live Arbitrum chains? You have the Ethereum Foundation running validators. You have the Arbitrum Foundation. You have Google Cloud. You have Consensus. You have Unit 410. You have a lot of the profession. You have Lido, P2P.
Is it permissionless? Like who can be a validator?
So today it's about a set of about 10 plus people that is not permissionless. But a goal there is to open it up to everyone. So what's holding that up? And this was already published previously. There's a new rollup protocol that will be proposed that is currently just about ready. It's actually in audit. It will be proposed to the Arbitrum DAO. It will be up to the Arbitrum DAO whether it wants to take this new rollup protocol, run it on the chain, and then open up permissionless validators. But I hope that it does, and the technology at that point will be ready for that. So today, validation is done by about 10 plus independent ecosystem players, and again, high value, highly reputable players. The technology is just about ready to open it up, to everyone. It's up to the Arbitrum DAO how it wants to adopt that technology, and that's really up to the Arbitrum DAO. In terms of the sequencer, though, so I'm not trying to minimize the role of the sequencer. The sequencer does one thing that's important. It orders transactions. And the other thing that it does is it can choose which transactions. So it can choose which transactions go in what order. So the first thing to note is a sequencer can't censor you over a long period of time, or even a really small period of time, because there is another option, which is rather than send your transaction to the sequencer, send it directly to Ethereum. There's an inbox in Ethereum where you can say, I'm going to send my transaction there. I'm going to send it's for Arbitrum. I'm going to send it to the Arbitrum inbox on Ethereum. You never need to speak to the sequencer, and the sequencer has to include that transaction. In fact, the sequencer will not be able to process any other deposits onto the Arbitrum chain until it includes that transaction. Right? It goes to the very, very same inbox, and it has to be processed in order. So there's a very, very strong mechanism against censorship by the sequencer. So okay, so we've taken out censorship. What is still in play? It's ordering of transactions or extraction.
So MEV.
MEV, exactly. That's really the key question here today. And there's a lot of different approaches to, okay, what do you do with that? Today, the reality is, the sequencer is centralized. Again, what can the sequencer do? It can extract MEV. It could reorder transactions. It can't steal money from your account. It can't force a bad transaction to come on chain. It can't really do anything else other than order transactions or reorder transactions. Today, there's a centralized guarantee, which the party running the sequencer is saying, we are not reordering transactions. We're serving transactions on a first-come, first-served basis. It will be nicer if that was not a promise that a centralized party is making you, but a decentralized promise. But again, I think the world here is a lot smaller than a lot of people realize, right? It's not the world of what the sequencer can do. A lot of people think it's providing security, that a single sequencer can steal money, it can put in bad transactions, it can withdraw. It can't do any of that. That's actually completely untrusted. The validators are the ones that are keeping the sequencer in check. Again, extracting MEV and getting a better guarantee there, but there's actually not even full consensus there in the community of what the approach is there, because there are some people that say we should minimize the extraction of MEV, implement a first come, first serve, or fair ordering protocol. We did a lot of work. I personally, when I was at Cornell and OffChain as a company, did a lot of work in developing these fair ordering protocols, and that is one option for how one might decentralize a sequencer. But others are actually saying, no, it's great. We should, reorder and you should extract this MEV and give it back to the chain. There's going to be a vibrant debate here. And again, I'm a community member. I don't have the ability to any more than anyone else to tell the Arbitrum sequencer, tell the Arbitrum DAO what sequencing approach it wants to take. So I imagine that there will be a vibrant community discussion here, because it's not clear. I have my opinions, but my opinions don't really matter that much. It's really up to what the community wants to do. Does it want to have a fair ordering protocol? Does it want to encourage reordering? Does it want to sell the right to reordering? Like, this is something which the community is very, very vibrant about, the larger community, and I think will be interesting on Arbitrum. But I just want to make that, I did one thing today to make that clear, which is
the sequencer can't steal your money. they can extract MEV.
Exactly. So in some sense, you say the worst case of the centralized sequencer is kind of what you have on Ethereum today, where the miner can reorder transactions in its block. It's a little different because the time horizon is different. The sequencer has control for longer periods of time. But I don't think people's mental model is that. Is Ethereum, people aren't saying Ethereum is centralized because a single block producer can go ahead and choose the ordering of transaction in this block. They sort of separated these two. If there's a security of Ethereum, there's a question of transaction ordering. And it's very, very similar in Arbitrum. And I think people don't appreciate that so much.
So who is controlling the sequencer?
Great question. So today it's the Arbitrum Foundation's responsibility to run the sequencer, but the Arbitrum DAO has the ability to change that, and to over time, as it's really right. The DAO controls, basically there's a sequencer key that's whitelisted, and the DAO controls who that is, and a DAO vote could change that. So if the DAO aligned and said, we want a sequencer that does this sort of sequencing strategy that's not first come first serve, the DAO could actually absolutely make that happen.
What do you think should be the sequencer strategy?
I think it should be up for community debate. I think that there are a lot of really smart people that have opinions there. We at OffChain Labs have presented a protocol that we think is a good idea, where it sort of mixes the two, where it has basically a fair ordering property along intervals, but within a small interval, say a few seconds, people can bid for ordering. That's one, that's from a technical perspective, that's one approach that we've put forward, which is it has fair ordering. So the sequencer wouldn't be able to say, not include, wait 10 minutes to include their transactions, but within a few seconds, or 2 seconds or so, it might be able to. That's one approach which we've discussed, which has, certain benefits to it. But ultimately, I think my opinion, or an OffChain Labs opinion, and our research team opinion is just one community voice, because there are others that will certainly have opinions. There's the Flashbots team, for example, that has different opinions here, and they're really it's really a topic that I think the community is very, very engaged on, and I imagine that it will be a lively discussion in the Arbitrum forums, and my opinion is just one voice like anyone else's here.
Okay, and then speaking of lively discussions, I wanted to touch on this bit of drama that Arbitrum had when, right after issuing its token and having its first governance vote. This was beginning of last month in April. So just recently, OffChain Labs kind of decentralized Arbitrum away into Arbitrum DAO to make all major decisions going forward, right? And that's why you launched the Arbitrum token. Now there was a bit of controversy around that first governance vote because the DAO approved to give the Arbitrum Foundation a bunch of tokens, and they also approved to give or loan to Wintermute, I believe, Arbitrum tokens, and so token holders, or I guess many token holders, felt like that wasn't a very transparent process. Those decisions were kind of rushed through, and that the DAO was kind of self, awarding it, awarding the Arbitrum Foundation tokens without much discussion with the broader token holder community. Now that's been resolved, I believe, adding kind of vesting to those tokens and other measures. But wanted to, get your take on kind of some of the lessons from all this.
So the first thing I'll say is a disclaimer again, which is I'm going to answer this as a community member. I'm not part of the Arbitrum Foundation. I work for OffChain Labs. OffChain Labs was a launch partner together with the Arbitrum Foundation, and others. Nansen, for example, was very helpful with designing the airdrop as well. So there were several different entities that helped really launch, launch partners for the Arbitrum DAO and decentralization of the network. And of course, I can speak to that period of time. But right now, particularly when this went down, I was. This was really not something which I am a community member, so I observed it, and I have comments and thoughts there and potentially context. But I just want to make clear my role there, and I'm not speaking in any capacity on the foundation because I don't have a role there and don't have a right to. But I think the primary issue there was one of communication. Communication around those tokens. There was, I think, a miscommunication in which these tokens were actually presented as being in the DAO bucket, but really they were in the foundation bucket. But in practice, if you look at the on-chain, this was a generation event where some tokens went to the foundation, some went to the DAO, some went to the airdrop, right? Some went to insiders like Team and investors and Future Team, and this is really part of the initial the initial distribution. But there was a miscommunication in how it was presented, and I think that led to a lot of confusion. I think that was really an unfortunate mistake, to be honest. But I think it was just that miscommunication, because if you look on chain, in fact, and if you look at AIP1 actually, so the governance proposal in question, it made clear that It also could have been clearer, but if you read through the entire thing, it made clear that these decisions had happened already, and it was just basically informing the DAO and asking for what they called the ratification. And I think a lot of people had a point, which is like, if it happened already, why are you asking for a ratifying vote? Ironically, I think part of the reason was to try to get transparency around these things. That's the irony here, but it's a fair point, which I think people were frustrated with, and I think a lot of that was miscommunicated, and could have been better. But I think and I'll say that I think a lot of the personally as a community member, the transparency from the foundation and the vesting, I think those are great things, right? I think that we as a community have ended up in a stronger place where the community has more insight into where things are going, where things are happening, and I hope that this sets a precedent for other DAOs as well, and other foundations as well, and others follow there. Because I think having community insight and transparency, when appropriate, is wonderful. Obviously, like any other company or foundation, there are going to be certain things that have certain confidentiality and certain requirements. If you want to enter business relationships with other parties, you can't certain things have to be held in confidence, but to the extent appropriate and possible, I think transparency and giving the community awareness is wonderful, and I'm glad to see that it happened, and I hope it happens in other communities as well. But I think to highlight the point, the one thing I'd focus on is, if you look at the Arbitrum DAO, it is the most powerful DAO and the most DAO that has the most really control of any other DAO, certainly of any other layer 2, but I'd argue even more broadly than that. And to be concrete, what are the powers of the DAO? So what was in discussion was these 750 million tokens, which is 7.5% of the token supply that was controlled by the foundation. Again, the foundation's mission was and is to service the DAO and the DAO's interests. But again, to my point before, sometimes the foundation, you need to have someone in the real world that can enter confidentiality agreements and contracts to represent your interests. And I think that's one of the critical needs of the foundation, which they've expressed, which I personally think is very reasonable and makes a lot of sense. But the thing is that this was 7.5% of the token supply, but there's 35+% of the token supply that's actually directly controlled by the DAO. No other layer 2 or most other other DAOs have this as well, right? There is no other layer 2 DAO that the token holders control directly any of the tokens, right? There's 35% of the tokens that are actually controlled by the DAO, and not only that, the DAO, as we mentioned before, when it comes to we can discuss technology and future developments, but ultimately I don't have control of that. OffChain doesn't have control of that because we've given up that, and the Arbitrum Foundation doesn't have control of that either. It's the DAO that has control of that. The Arbitrum Live networks today are the only networks that actually have self-executing governance. What does that mean? It means there's a vote, or the token holders vote, and they decide something, and that actually takes effect and happens. So let's talk about upgradability. If someone proposes an upgrade to the chain, it's the token holders can actually affect that, and you don't need someone else to come in and say, "Oh, here's a vote, but we're the ones with the key, and we're going to turn that key." Arbitrum is really, it seems obvious that this is the way it should be, but Arbitrum is unique that it actually has the DAO in direct control of both this treasury as well as the upgradability of the chain. And by the way, it's not only the 35% of the tokens, all the revenue from the network, the net revenue. So some of it's paid out in layer 1 by the sequencer, but the net revenue is actually all kept by the DAO, right? So there's there's a lot of ETH that has accumulated to the treasury as well. And so there's a ton of there's a real control. Self-executing governance puts real power in this DAO in a way that no other layer 2 and many other DAOs don't actually have that. There is no multi-sig here that really controls this. There is a security council which can step in if it needs to be, if there's like a bug or something on the chain. This is where there's something else goes wrong, and the security council has 12 community members, and we need 9 out of 12 to do something. But and this is in line with Vitalik's vision of his presentation of a security council that has a three-quarter requirement to act quickly. But that would be someone stepping in, in the normal flow of things. There is no one that can that needs to step in to affect the DAO's decision, right? The DAO can decide to vote on an upgrade, and it actually controls that. So the irony here is, I think not the irony, but the thing I should say that we should focus on, and again, I think that everything that happened actually landed the Arbitrum DAO in an even better place, but also it's important to recognize that Arbitrum DAO has unprecedented amounts of decentralized power today, more decentralized than most other projects. Again, that's the ability to control upgradability, the ability to control the treasury, which includes that 35%, but also the fees that flow into it from the operation of the chains, and also things like the Arbitrum DAO can remove and elect and expand and the size and the members of the Arbitrum Foundation board as well. So it really has direct oversight and control of the Arbitrum board as well, and that was something that was in place even beforehand. So I think that certainly today the Arbitrum DAO is the most decentralized DAO that exists, and hopefully it's a model for other DAOs of how to really give up power to the DAO.
Awesome. I mean, great to hear about the self-executing governance, because we've seen so many times, DAOs, there's a governance vote, but then the decision doesn't go kind of the way that major holders wanted to, and then they just have another vote until they get what they actually want. So no, that's really interesting. I'm just wondering, the Arbitrum DAO is made up of ARB token holders, right? Like they are the ones who vote. Are tokens concentrated in, say, the Arbitrum Foundation? Like, does the Arbitrum Foundation effectively have control over most tokens, and so control of the Arbitrum DAO?
No. So 35% of the tokens, like a little more than 35%, actually sit in the DAO treasury, right? So not controlled by the fund, really controlled directly by the DAO. The Arbitrum Foundation, assuming this, with the new proposal vested over time, will have 7.5% of the tokens, but by the Constitution, those tokens don't count to the on-chain thresholds. Those will be excluded, and not only that, it won't vote, and it is not allowed to vote. So the Arbitrum Foundation's tokens don't vote, and similarly, and those actually won't be delegated either. Those just don't count. For OffChain Labs, for team members that from OffChain Labs and investors, so that have received tokens, those are all subject to lockups. Those lockups unlocks happen over 4 years, and nothing happens within 1 year. But more than that, OffChain Labs as a policy says that team members cannot vote with the tokens that they have, as long as they're employed at OffChain Labs. We do allow at OffChain Labs team members to delegate tokens to parties they don't control, like community members and other delegates in the community, including some of the largest delegates on the chain today are university blockchain clubs. So, but that's really to support the community. But no OffChain Labs employee by policy is allowed to vote, and that includes myself, that includes my co-founders, that includes everyone. So, but we are allowed to delegate to community members to strengthen the community. So I think both by policy and in practice, it's really the community that controls. And actually, you mentioned this AIP1, this governance failure. You can just look there. Where did the votes come from? Those votes didn't come from investors. Those votes didn't come from team insiders, right? Those votes came from the community, and actually every vote that happened in those snapshots that failed were just community members that received their tokens and their airdrops, or those that they delegated to, but it was it was them that had it. And furthermore, it failed, right? So if power was controlled in the foundation, or power was somehow controlled by investors or by OffChain Labs, that vote probably wouldn't have failed, right? Right? Obviously, the foundation didn't. There was a miscommunication, but the point is, the foundation doesn't have control, of that, and to the point that its very, very first governance proposal actually failed. And I think that's a testament to the strength of the community. And if you ever have any questions in the Arbitrum ecosystem of who holds this control, just look back to AIP1, the very first proposed governance proposal, and see what happened there. And I think the where the power lies should become very, very clear, from there on.
So these are kind of the new layer 2 kids on the block, I guess. They've been preparing to launch for a few months, and now they're coming live, and they've been just highly anticipated in kind of the blockchain world because they claim that they have better, more decentralized, more powerful scaling capabilities and optimistic rollups, and there's like just fierce competition for like who reigns in the CK rollup world. What do you think? I mean, are they a threat to optimistic rollups as kind of the reigning Ethereum L2?
I don't think that they are. First of all, I'll start to say that there are a bunch of really incredible teams building in this space. I personally, well before my role at OffChain Labs, but even as an academic, always had a lot of respect for Eli Ben-Sasson, and he's built a fantastic team around him at Starkware, for example. Polygon, their ZK EVM team has some fantastic people in there as well. Jordy and Bobbin is really fantastic. Fantastic people there, and fantastic researchers that are making really, really good progress and faster than people expected on the application and the development of zero knowledge technologies. And I think that's something that we should applaud. I think that's exciting. And but if you ask me, like, what do I think about this technology and whether or not it's a threat, I don't think it is. In fact, ZK proofs weren't foreign to us when we were sitting at Princeton, trying to scale blockchains. I'd done research as an academic in ZK proofs, like my PhD. My focus was in cryptography, and I have a lot of awareness of the technology at the time, to say the least, and still do. And there's a reason why we chose to build a scaling technology that didn't rely on that. And it comes down to a few things. One is cost. 2 is compatibility, and 3 is maturity. The cost, compatibility, and maturity of optimistic rollups is far, far ahead of ZK rollups. And by cost, I mean both the on-chain costs, but also the proving costs. The on-chain costs will amortize over time with usage. Some of them are high today because they don't have much usage, but that will eventually amortize. But the proving costs are large, and people don't usually like to talk about those. And those also happen off-chain, so there's not very much visibility or transparency, right? If a ZK rollup is producing a proof, they don't have to and that proof, the proof will become public, but how much work and how much time it took to, or how much effort it took to actually produce that proof is not generally transparent or visible on chain, but often it's expensive. And also compatibility. Things that are expensive in a ZK rollup might be cheap in an optimistic rollup, and just getting EVM compatibility has been a challenge for them. And a lot of these, there are a bunch of them, so I don't want to speak each of them are a little bit different, but areas of difficulty for speaking in general have been getting support for different cryptographic operations, hash functions, things that are super cheap in the EVM become more expensive there. So they'll use a different hash function, and their gas accounting will be different, and they'll be much less compatible with the feature set that people have come to use. And certainly when you look to expanded feature sets like Arbitrum Stylus, which is that what I mentioned previously, that's going to bring on C and C++ and Rust in short order, that's going to be a great development to users. But I think ZK rollups will have a much more difficult time if they or virtually impossible for them to actually bring those features to market, because they've made so many decisions that have in its attempt to get EVM compatibility, they've made so many sort of hard-coded decisions and optimizations that I think will make it much harder to support a different infrastructure over time. But actually, again, so often was the case previously, there were no live ZK rollups. So people were saying there's this great thing called a ZK rollup. It's going to be cheaper. It's going to be faster. It's going to be better. It's actually going to deliver you breakfast in the morning. That's a joke. But the point is, it's very hard to fight with a fairy tale. And that's where, and again, it's not to the nothing wrong with these teams, but they had a vision, which is a great vision. But the point is, sometimes people don't appreciate that it takes there's a path to get to the vision. And Arbitrum, if you look at Arbitrum, they'd also started with a vision and had different iterations. Like Arbitrum Nitro went live 1 year after Arbitrum went live, right? There was a massive improvement there over time as well. And I think people like to say, let's compare Arbitrum today to some futuristic ZK technology, not realizing that these are both technologies that have both different potential and are both have the ability to evolve. Should in Arbitrum's case, should the DAO choose to take on new upgrades, have the ability to evolve over time. And I think that's something people miss. So it's actually, it's good to actually have live ZK rollups, because it's not, it's not me saying this or someone else saying somewhere. It's like, look, like you transact, like there are these developer incompatibilities, and you'll run into them you'll run into them. It doesn't mean it's impossible to use, but these incompatibilities do exist, and you'll find them. And the cost, like, hey, it actually costs significantly more to use a ZK rollup today than it does to cost an optimistic rollup. And another big benefit, so let's zoom out for a second. I guess my point there is that, like, now there's something concrete there, and people can compare these. And I think the experience on an optimistic an Arbitrum is far better than the experience on the ZK rollups we have today. That doesn't mean that they can improve over time, but again, the Arbitrum DAO can improve Arbitrum over time as well. So it's so now there's a apples to apples comparison. Let's look at where the technologies are today. But yeah, if we zoom out for a second, I think it's when we set out at OffChain Labs to build the best scaling technology, we didn't come with a specific tool in hand, right? If you look at the name of some of these ZK rollup companies, often they have the ZK or some form of ZK or SNARK or STARK built into their name. That wasn't the case for OffChain Labs, because the vision for OffChain Labs was build and develop the best technology available to scale blockchains, right? There's a subtle difference between the vision of a lot of the ZK rollups, which is scale blockchains using ZK technology, right? Those sounds very similar, but they're actually very, very different. So, if there's a point in time where it makes sense where ZK technologies evolve and they have readiness to actually compete with optimistic rollups on these core metrics of cost and compatibility, I think that it could make sense for us at OffChain to consider building technology that involves ZK technology. It could make sense for the Arbitrum DAO to include to consider incorporating aspects of that into those chains. I'm not convinced that will happen today, but I can't see the future. But the point is, my vision is never a maxi on a particular technology. It's a maxi in a particular result, and the result is delivering the best scale to users today, because the users today need that scaling solutions, and they don't really care. It's like almost like our discussion before, which is, so we discussed like the interactive fraud proofs. Like, the users see that? No, they actually don't. The users don't see that. So the users, what the users do see is what are they paying, and they also, again, they need to have, from my perspective, even though they don't see it, they need to have a high security chain, because in the downside they could see something if something goes wrong. So you need to have the security backup there. You need to have the great developer experience. So one question is, so what is the promised what is the promised thing that ZK rollups deliver that optimistic rollups that are supposed to is better than optimistic rollups? So the really main thing, and the main thing that they've claimed to offer over time, and the reason why people, I think, have a preference on this axis, is when it comes to withdrawing from the chains. In optimistic rollups, you have this delay period, currently set at 1 week, although there's promising research that will shrink that, but currently set at 1 week. Whereas ZK rollups always have said, they can give instant withdrawals. The thing, again, and this is something else, which is now you can actually point to the live chains. They actually can't give instant withdrawals. They can give withdrawals as fast as a proof can get accepted on Ethereum.
And how fast is that?
So at the very, very minimum, it has to be enough time for an Ethereum transaction to get through, which is pretty quick, or to get probably 10 minutes, because you want to get the reorg. You want to make sure that it's going to stay on Ethereum and not get reorged. But yeah, that's a good question. In practice, though, so if you look at these chains, some of them, it takes minutes to sometimes hours or half day plus for them to generate these proofs for relatively small batches, right? So one chain live today, it takes them, I haven't looked in a few weeks, it was taking them about 13 hours to generate one of the ZK proofs for a batch of roughly 500 transactions. And that's not instant, right? That's actually much worse than instant. It's about 13 hours of delay. Now, you might say, well, 13 hours is better than a week, or in one case, and the answer is, Yes and no. Yes, sure, but no, because if you're a trader, you're not saying, all right, I did my trade, I'll come back tomorrow. You're probably going to say, okay, I'm going to use Hop or Connect or one of these other or Coinbase or Binance to get my funds off as quickly as I want, right? The difference between instant and not instant is a lot bigger than the difference between 13 hours and a week. And particularly, again, optimistic worlds definitely have a path. My co-founder, Ed Felton, recently published a post on ETH Research showing that there's a really cool trick now that with Ethereum proof of stake, you can detect censorship attacks on chain. So it has a path where you can potentially move this down to comfortably like a day or so. But even putting that aside, it's not instant, and it's already. And this goes back to the proof cost. Remember, I said generating these proofs, the cost point. Generating these proofs is expensive and it's timely, and that's when they're doing relatively low transaction volume. The cost of generating the proof is actually, it's at best linear, but it's generally super linear, which means the more transactions that you include, the more per transaction cost it actually takes to generate that proof. It's a small increase, but it's at least linear. It's at best a cost, a per transaction cost. And the idea is, so if we're seeing these large proof times today, and again, there are some that are taking minutes, some are taking many hours. So there are different approaches here. If you see these large proof times today, it's going to get worse over. Some things will get better. Their hardware, their technology will get better, but also if you want to turn that into thousands of transactions or millions of transactions, as some of them claim, it's going to get a lot worse, and you're going to need to really keep up, not to make that experience even worse. So I actually think that one of the promised things, and people don't realize this, that the proofs aren't instant, and the benefits that you get from validity proofs only happen once you actually have the validity proof on chain. And in practice, and here's the interesting thing, what you have is, what is the guarantee? We'll get back to sequencers now, so we'll tie everything up nicely. What is the guarantee you're getting when you're transacting with a ZK rollup versus an optimistic rollup? You're in the ZK rollup. You're actually you're getting your first interactions with the sequencer. It's going to give you a result, and that will have no proof connected to it, and that proof might not be there for hours in some cases. But in optimistic rollups like Arbitrum, your transaction is put on chain very quickly. So even though there's the proving process, the week hasn't been waited, you can look on chain and distrust the sequencer and know that your transaction is included. You can run your node and say, I know it might take Ethereum a week to figure this out, but I know based on what I see on chain, just on Ethereum, that my transaction is included because it's deterministic from there. There's a debate in the ZK rollup world of whether they put what they call the input data on chain or the state diff on chain. And some ZK rollups do the same thing that Arbitrum does, is they put that input data on chain. But some of them actually only post the data at the end, like when they finish at an interval. And in that case, actually, the finality of a ZK rollup is going to be much worse, because in Arbitrum you'll at least be able to say, okay, my transaction has finality in 30 seconds or so on the live chains because I see it's posted on Ethereum and no one can change it, only the sequencer. In some of these other designs, the data is actually only showing up at the end. And therefore, you have this long period of time where the only one you're trusting is, it's not like, you're not trusting math, as they like to say, you're not trusting the ZK proof, you're actually just trusting the sequencer that it will eventually post your data on a proof of that data. So I actually think in some ZK rollup designs, particularly in the ones that wait to post the transaction data and only post it at the end, the finality is actually significantly worse than optimistic rollups, and this is pretty fundamental. So anyway, it's probably more than you bargained for, but those are my some of my quick thoughts on ZK.
No, super interesting. Yeah, and I mean, the criticism for optimistic rollups that the withdrawal time is a week that's really common, but I didn't know about the difference between the finality and that you could actually know that the transaction went through before and just have that while in some ZK rollup designs I guess that's not the case, and you have to wait until the transaction is actually posted.
Exactly, and in practice, what's going to happen is when people want to withdraw quickly, both in ZK rollups as they exist today, as they will exist as they get more transactions, and in optimistic rollups, you're probably going to use one of these fast bridging solutions. So the practical, unless you want to wait, but if you don't want to wait, for those users that want to quickly go back and forth between chains, they're going to want to use one of these fast bridging solutions, and particularly if they're going back, right? So the only benefits of bridging, the only differences in ZK rollup and Optimistic rollup are bridging to Ethereum. Certainly, if you're going to another network, you're going to be in the same boat as well. And as we see, an increasingly multi-chain world, whether or not it's my vision or not, that's just a vision. That's what's happening. There are lots of chains and people jumping back and forth for different opportunities. I think you're going to see a lot of this, a lot of the same patterns where people are using these third-party bridges, and that's how they're actually getting back and forth between these chains. So, anyway, I think the similarities are. I think a lot of the proposed benefits are actually further off or more difficult than people actually realized. But again, I think there are fantastic teams doing really good work in ZK rollups. That's my opinion. But this whole space, like I mentioned before, the application layer and on the protocol layer as well, we're all better off with more experimentation. And I think so I'm glad to have wonderful other teams building along with us, and I think that they're doing a fantastic job, and excited to see what they can accomplish.
For sure. I mean, it's hard stuff to solve the scaling dilemma. To just wrap up. What's kind of the biggest next milestone for Arbitrum that we should be looking forward to?
Great question. So this is again where I point to. It's hard for me in a centralized way to speak about milestones. I can talk about, I mentioned some before, of technology that I'm excited about that we're working on at OffChain Labs. And some of that is, will interact with and can build on the Arbitrum Nitro stack. And that includes things like Arbitrum Stylus, the ability to write languages in C and C++ and Rust, and really eventually any other language that compiles to WASM on a chain running the Arbitrum Nitro technology. But that's where I can stop, right? I can build technology and others can build technology. But today, the path to getting technology on the Arbitrum chains are actually going to the DAO, presenting the audits and saying, hey, what do you think about this? And it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out for the first time, how the first technical upgrade proposals will happen. And I imagine that there will be many people with different opinions, and it won't be, there are lots of very good technical teams in the space that might also prepare upgrades. I don't think it will just be, OffChain Labs. There are many others that many service providers that the foundation can and will work with, and so I can't really speak. It's the community decision what will happen in the chain. The things that I'm excited about. I'm excited about the development of the Stylus technology. I'm also very excited about what we touched on earlier, the new challenge protocol design that will enable really good, a much better challenge protocol that will also bound the delay cost and will set the path for opening up validation to everyone on an Arbitrum Nitro chain. Whether and how the DAO decides to incorporate those technologies and what its roadmap are, or what other technologies that the DAO and the foundation want to fund, those are that's I think up to the community.
Awesome, super interesting, Steven. Thank you so much for breaking down all of the intricacies of Arbitrum. What's next? All the differences with other optimistic rollups, with CK rollups. Really, really great chat, and you do have kind of the ability of explaining these complicated topics in simple terms. So I appreciate that. Thanks so much again for coming on the show.
Thank you so much for having me.